Right, so Luke's Gospel in chapter 7. Luke's Gospel. I just want to briefly just look at why it is that Luke is writing. The Gospel of Luke is addressed to a friend of Luke's named Theophilus. And in chapter 1, in the first 4 verses, we have a helpful description on why Luke is writing and who he's writing to. And in Luke chapter 1, Luke says to his friend Theophilus, "Inasmuch as many have taken in hand to set in order a narrative of those things which have been fulfilled among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write to you an orderly account, most excellent Theophilus." So what's going on here? Theophilus is a friend of Luke's. We don't know whether he was a believer at this point or not. Many think that he wasn't when Luke writes the book of Luke, the Gospel of Luke, and that he had become a Christian by the time that Luke writes Acts, because Luke and Acts, of course, are like 2 volumes of, it's like one story, but 2 volumes. And so Luke is writing Luke, and Luke is also writing Acts, and so some people think, okay, he wrote to Theophilus the Gospel of Luke. He learned about Jesus Christ because Theophilus would have heard, think about it, he would have heard the story about this man Jesus who had been going around and who had been doing things. And a lot of these rumors would have been untrue. Some would have been true. So there would have been a lot of gossip going around about who this Jesus is and was and what actually happened. And so Luke, in order to straighten things out for his friend Theophilus, goes and he uses his sort of investigative powers to go and put together an accurate account. He says in verse 4, "I wrote all these things, that you may know the certainty of those things in which you were instructed." Theophilus, you had heard some things. You had been instructed with some things, but there are other stories going around. But I put this together, this account of the life of Christ as he was here on earth, so that you would know the certainty of those things. And it's very interesting, this word. Some translations say, so that you may know the exact truth of the things that you have been taught. Here in the New King James Version, it says, so that you may know the certainty of those things that you have been taught. Why are the different words? Because the one Greek word contains both meanings. Luke, in other words, wants Theophilus to know the exact truth. He wants to know the truth accurately. That's important, isn't it? We have to know the truth accurately. But it's more than just being accurate. Because if we just left it there, it would be seemingly sort of just intellectual, right? But here, Luke is saying, I want you to know the exact truth. But this exact truth, I want you to have a certainty about it. I want you to know, in other words, Theophilus, I want you to know the truth about Jesus of Nazareth in such a way that it does something to you. It secures you. I want you to know the certainty of those things. I don't just want you to know it accurately. You must know it accurately. But I want you to know it in such a way that it brings you a certainty about the truth concerning Jesus Christ. And so as we read the rest of the Gospel of Luke, we have to bear this in mind, as this is the whole point. So that we might know the truth and to be certain about the truth. So that we can build our lives upon the truth. Because apart from a solid, certain truth, we have no foundation for our lives. I don't know about you, but for me, I have not found anywhere else such a solid foundation for my life as I have in God's Word. All other things in this world are shifting sand. You can try to build your life upon it. You can try to spend your life in different pursuits of different things, whether they be moral things or immoral things, but they do not hold up. Eventually you're left empty and you're wanting something more. Nothing has filled the void. And this is the point that Luke is making to Theophilus. Here it is. This is the truth as it is in Jesus. Now, have certainty about these things and build your life upon these things. Have faith in the Son of God, in other words. And so Luke writes his gospel. Now, in Luke chapter 4, verse 18, we have a wonderful verse that helps us, again, to understand what Luke is driving at in writing this letter. So in Luke chapter 4, and I'll read from verse 16 to 20. This part of Luke's book is meant to help Theophilus understand everything else that is going to happen in this gospel from here on out. In other words, let's imagine Theophilus is reading through the book of Luke, and he gets to, let's say, chapter 10, or let's say chapter 8, and suddenly he gets to chapter 8, and he goes, wait a minute, hold on. I'm forgetting what was the point here. It's almost as if Theophilus can go back to chapter 4 and verse 18 and remind himself, this is what Luke was driving at. Well, what is this? What is this guiding principle that is supposed to be helping Theophilus, and it should help us understand the gospel? Well, look at what Luke writes. So he came to Nazareth. He's talking about Jesus here. Jesus is now about to enter into his public ministry. He had just spent time in the wilderness, and now he comes to Nazareth, where he had been brought up. And as was his custom, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day, this is Christ, and he stood up to read. So this was a common practice, and he was handed the book of the prophet Isaiah. Obviously, they didn't have Bibles like we did, and so it would have been a scroll of sorts that would have been unrolled, handed to Jesus, because different people in the synagogue were given the responsibility of reading from the Old Testament. And so they would have given him the scroll of Isaiah, and he would have opened that, and he would have found the place where it was written this, and this is what we read at the beginning of our service. He found the place where this was written: "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord." Then he closed the book and gave it back to the attendant and sat down. And the eyes of all who were in the synagogue were fixed on him. So this verse 18, where he quotes from Isaiah, and clearly what Christ is saying here, he's reading this, intending that the people who are listening realize that this verse in Isaiah, all the way back then, is referring to him, Jesus of Nazareth. And what has he come to do? He has come to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal brokenhearted people, proclaim freedom or liberty to people who are captives, to preach and and he has sent him to recover the sight of the blind, and to set at liberty those who are oppressed, and to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. This is what should be driving Theophilus. This is what is driving Luke throughout the rest of the gospel. And Theophilus can come back if he wanted to, time and time again, to this verse and remind himself, this is what Luke is getting at. And so that helps us, because when we turn to chapter 4 of Luke's gospel, to chapter 8 of Luke's gospel, that's sort of one big chunk of Luke's gospel. It's like a section in his book. And what chapter 4 to chapter 8 is doing is demonstrating verse 18 that we've just read. The fact that the Spirit of the Lord is upon Christ because he has anointed me or set him apart to do all these things. Preach the gospel to the poor. As Luke makes his way to chapter 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, he's showing Theophilus, this is it. This is the demonstration. This is the proof of what he said here in verse 18. Did he come to preach the gospel to the poor? Yes. Read chapters 4 to 8. Did he come to heal the brokenhearted? Yes. Read chapters 4 to 8. Did he come to proclaim liberty to the captives? Yes, Theophilus. Read chapters 4 to 8. Because there I'm going to show you how he did this. And so in verses 16 to 20 of chapter 4, one of the things that we find Luke showing Theophilus is that it is of this kind of people, it is of such people that Christ is going to form into a new covenant community. The old covenant community of God was Israel. But now Christ has come and he has fulfilled the law and the purpose for which Israel existed in order to bring the coming of the Messiah. That has been done and he has fulfilled the law. And now Christ is forming a new covenant people, and they will be the covenant people now from this time forward. What are they going to be like? Are they going to be Jews? Are they going to be circumcised? Are they going to have all these laws that you find in the Old Testament and ceremonies and rules that were established? No, it's not going to be like that anymore. It's going to be like this. And the people are going to be like this. It's gone way beyond the Jews now. This is including Gentiles in a far greater way than it ever had in the past. And so chapters 4 to 8 is showing all of this. I could go through with you right now. Let's just briefly, you don't have to turn to these passages, but let me just explain to you what he does in chapters 4 to 8. Christ casts out an unclean spirit in chapter 4. He heals Peter's mother-in-law of an illness in chapter 4. Also in chapter 4, Christ heals the sick and possessed in a town in which he's in. Christ then in chapter 5 calls Peter, James, and John to follow him. Again, these aren't the kind of people you would have expected to be followers of Jesus of Nazareth. So do you see, Luke is showing Theophilus, you remember chapter 4 verse 18? Do you remember why the Spirit of the Lord came upon Christ, or was upon Christ? Do you remember why he was set apart? In order to preach the gospel to the poor, to heal brokenhearted. These are them. These are those brokenhearted people. These are those poor people. These are those captive people. He heals in chapter 5 a leper. He heals a paralyzed man again in chapter 5. Christ then calls Matthew a tax collector. Right? Just bear that in mind. I've come to preach to the poor. But Matthew is a tax collector, and he's called to follow Christ. He's not poor, is he? Oh, he's poor in a very different way than you expect. He may not be financially poor, but he is clearly spiritually poor. Christ in chapter 6 heals a man with a withered hand. Christ then appoints his apostles, and they're an unlikely ragtag bunch. We've just mentioned Matthew. He sets aside Matthew as one of his apostles. Now, Matthew is a tax collector who many Jews really didn't like, these tax collectors, because they kind of came alongside the Romans, who they felt were their oppressors. But Matthew seems to be able to feel like he can come alongside and do some of their work and be a tax collector. And so if you were like a real Jew, Matthew's not a real Jew. I'm a real Jew. Matthew's compromised. He's been willing to work with the Romans in order to collect taxes. And it's one of these kind of guys that Christ sets aside as his apostles. But then you also have another man named Judas who is a zealot. This would have been a man who would have not only opposed Rome and not liked Rome, but he would have actually been involved with potentially terrorist activities against Rome. That's how much he hated Rome. So you have one guy who's willing to compromise with Rome. You have another guy who's like a terrorist in Rome's eyes. And yet Christ calls both these men to be an apostle. It's remarkable. This is not the kind of setup that you would have expected from God when it comes to the establishment of his kingdom in this world. But Christ goes on in chapter 6 and he heals a great multitude again. Christ then heals a Roman soldier's servant in chapter 7. And he also raises a widow's son in chapter 7. And then we come to our passage in chapter 7, verse 36 to 50. So does that make sense? Do you see what he's doing there? Luke is helping Theophilus see that this Christ who had been set apart for this purpose, again, to preach the gospel to the poor and to heal the brokenhearted and all that, look, here's how he did it. And this, our passage in chapter 7, is one of those accounts where Luke demonstrates how it is that Christ preached to the poor and healed the brokenhearted and set free those who were captive by their sin and helped them and to have their eyes open that they might see the truth. And he set this lady that we're going to look at free from her sin, which had absolutely destroyed her life. And in chapter 7 and verse 34, just before the passage that we're going to look at, you'll notice one of the things that's happening all throughout what Christ is doing. All these stories that I've just listed. Throughout all of these stories, you have this little thread that's woven throughout. And it grows as Luke goes on in his gospel. And that is this, that while he's doing these things, Christ, he continues to experience growing opposition from the religious do-gooders of the day. The Pharisees oppose the work which he is doing. The religious people, the people you would have expected to have anticipated and recognized the coming Messiah of their own religion. And they didn't. And here he is in front of them, and not only did they not recognize them, they outwardly opposed him, as well as inwardly opposed him. So you have all of this going on in Luke's gospel as you come up to chapter 7 and verse 36. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to consider a number of things this evening, and as I said, on the 18th of September when I'm back. And we're going to look at chapters 36 to 50. And we're going to look at the Pharisee in this passage. And we're going to look at the woman in this passage. And what we're going to do over the 2 Sundays is we're going to compare and contrast these two. We're going to ask the question, what did they have in common in this story? And we're going to ask the question, how were they different in this story? But for this evening, all I want us to briefly consider is this woman. I want us to behold this woman in this passage. And let's look at how Luke describes this woman in our passage. And the first thing I want us to look at, beginning in verse 36 and 37, is I want you to notice that Luke highlights the fact that this woman had an inferior social status. Okay, look at verse 37. Luke says, and behold, right? Look at this. I mean, don't just skim over that word behold. Look. Pay attention to this, Theophilus. This is something extraordinary. This is something worth stopping for a second and think about. Behold, what? What, Luke? A woman. That may not ring in your ears anything, but for Theophilus, in the day in which Luke was writing, that would have said loads to Theophilus. A woman in the city who was a sinner when she knew that Jesus was sat at the table of the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster flask of fragrant oil, and stood at Christ's feet. In this house of the Pharisee, there is a woman, and women in their day were considered as inferior. Luke is saying to Theophilus, consider this. In this story that I'm about to tell you, Theophilus, it has to do with a Pharisee and a woman. And I want you to notice the difference between these two, Theophilus. I want you to know the difference between the Pharisee and this woman, this inferior, so-called inferior person. In the day and age that Luke is writing, women were on the bottom of the social ladder. For instance, just before this passage in chapter 7, I mentioned briefly the story of the widow of Nain. Now, there was this lady, she was a widow, but she still had her son, but apparently her son had died. As Christ and his disciples are making their way down the road, a funeral procession is coming the opposite direction. And so you have this sort of, it's remarkable, isn't it? You sort of have this coming together of death and life, right? Christ, who is the life, comes into contact with this scene of death. It's a funeral procession. And here, this widow, she's a lady. She's on the bottom of the social ladder. She doesn't have a husband to take care of her, so she has to fully depend upon her son, who has now died. And now what? What's she going to do now? The only hope she has is that somebody will have mercy on her. Otherwise, she's going to be destitute, living on the streets, or who knows what else she may have to, in order to make a living. Because they didn't have a welfare state. They couldn't live on benefits, She had no hope. Her husband and now her son had died. And here comes the funeral, and Christ and his disciples are coming the other way, and they meet. And what does Christ do? He has mercy upon her. The very thing that she needed. How? How did he have mercy on her? He raised her son from the dead. Christ has the power to do this, to raise dead people to life. He has the ability to take we who are born spiritually dead, which eventually would lead to eternal death, and he has the ability to arrest that and stop that and bring life out of that. And this is what Christ does to this woman. So again, why does he do that? Because women were considered, like I said, as bottom of the social ladder. And he knew that, and he knew that woman, if she didn't have her son, she wouldn't be taken care of. And so he raises her son from the dead. And now you must have, obviously she would have been absolutely thrilled that her son was alive. She would have been rejoicing like a mother. Yes, my son is alive. But you better believe she would have also been thinking, that's also a great help to me, because I don't know how I was going to get by. Thank you, Lord Jesus, for looking after me. This lady here in this account that is in the house of the Pharisee is a woman, Luke says, and he highlights that and says, Theophilus, behold that. Here she is, insignificant in society's eyes, helpless, dispensable. Indeed, women, particularly women like this, or widows and orphans especially as well, were considered a burden on society. And it's that kind of person that Luke says to Theophilus, she was there. There was a woman in that Pharisee's house. So that's the first thing about this woman that Luke mentions. What about the second thing? Well, he says that she was not only a woman. Luke goes on to say that she had a corrupt and an immoral and a seedy reputation. Look at verse 37 again. And behold, Theophilus, a woman, yes, inferior in society of the day in which they lived, but she was also a sinner. She had a reputation in town for being a sinner. Not only was this woman insignificant, but she had a stain on her character. I assume, I don't know all of, I could be mistaken here, but I assume that we all have no fear going out in society and walking down the aisles of Asda, and we don't fear anyone looking at us and saying, it's that person. Oh my days, avoid them. I've heard about that person. We don't have to fear that. This woman would not have been able to go to the market, as it were, in her day. She wouldn't have been able to go there without someone noticing her and maybe even going the other direction. Oh dear, there she is, go. She had a terrible reputation. We think it's because she was a prostitute. Obviously, something had happened in her life. Did she make poor choices? We don't know. Maybe she did she obviously made poor choices. But why did she make poor choices? Was it because she just was overcome by her desires and passions? Was it because her husband had died? Was it because of that she had to turn to selling herself as a prostitute in order to make money so that she could live? We don't know, but we can imagine. But whatever it was immoral. She was not made for that. And that means that she would have been sinning against her conscience as a result, because God has written his law upon our hearts. And she would have known that whatever it was that she was involved in was wrong. And as a result, she had a stain on her character, and it was well known throughout the city. She was immoral, she was impure, she was vile. She would have been considered a cast-off. And as I said, she would have had the reputation of someone in the city to be avoided. You can almost imagine, if you know anything about the terrible, wicked industry that exists of prostitution, you know how sick and wicked and vile it is. And you can almost imagine, as this is happening in this day, a new man comes into the village, into the city, and maybe he's feeling a bit frisky. He's like, I'm going to find me a lady, I'm going to fulfill my passions. And he walks down the road and he sees her, and you can almost imagine a mate of his coming alongside and saying, no, not that one. No, not there. No. Well, I mean, no, you don't want to go there. Why? Well, I could tell you why, and we could talk, they're kids here, right? We're not going to go there. But the reason I'm saying this is because we need to understand the seriousness of what's going on here and the significance of what it is that is happening in this account. She had a reputation for being a sinner, a well-known sinner. She was corrupt and immoral. But Luke goes on to explain this woman and says that she had been informed about the location of Jesus and as a result attended where he was present. Look at verse 37 again. And behold, a woman in the city who was a sinner, when she knew that Jesus sat at the table in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster flask and fragrant oil. In other words, she went there. How could she bring an alabaster flask without going there? She clearly had been informed about where this Jesus of Nazareth was, and she went where he was present. She was willing, in other words, to draw near to Christ in front of others, despite her reputation. Think about that. Despite her reputation and despite the location of where Christ was, right? This isn't a lady going to another lady like herself's house and hanging out. This is a lady who is considered dirty and vile and immoral, and she's going to the house of a Pharisee, somebody who's goody-goody, somebody who you would have walked into their door and everything would have been in its right place, and the kids would have been sat nice, and they would have been really, really respectful, and yes, sir, and no, ma'am, and all this kind of stuff, right? That kind of person. And this lady of the world goes there. Now, we need to understand something about this. The Pharisee had invited Christ over to his house. And when things like that happened, and it was a bit of a to-do, it was a bit of a festivity, it was not uncommon in these parts, in this day, it was not uncommon that when you had something like this on, that you'd have your table spread, and whoever was invited as a guest was, it's a bit of a party, and they would be, you would have had the table there on the ground, and people would have sat on their arms, right? They didn't sit down in chairs. They would have leaned over and kind of laid on the ground like this with their feet behind them away from the table, because remember, they walked everywhere. They always had dirty feet. So those feet, you didn't want those feet close to the food, did you? No, you'd want them away. So people would often lean like this on the ground with their feet behind them. People would be sat around, and you would oftentimes leave your door open, if you even had a door. But it would have been well known amongst people that if something like that was going on, I'm allowed to just walk in and say, stand against the wall and listen to what's going on. And there would have been maybe a little bit of a crowd in this room. And this is what this woman is doing. She's obviously heard about what was going on. There's this event that is happening. It wouldn't have been uncommon for strangers to be allowed to just walk in and to stand there and to, let's gather around and let's hear what's going on. There's this guest here. His name's Jesus. Do you hear about Jesus? Yeah, I've heard about Jesus. Well, there he is. And who's that? Well, that's this Pharisee guy, Simon, And Simon sat there. He's invited Jesus over, and it's a bit of a to-do. So let's all gather around, Oh, look, some sausages. Let's grab some sausages, maybe. This is what was allowed, and it was normal in their day. Okay? We need to understand that this woman had heard where Jesus was at, and she went there. where he was present. No wonder Luke says, what a sight to behold. Because remember, she had a reputation, and there would have been a crowd there. And she, despite her reputation, goes to that place right where they would have noticed her. They all would have known who it was. Indeed, some of them may have been surprised. Some of them would have been like, what's she doing here? No, oh man, why don't we do invitations to these things, No, she came in and she was there despite her reputation. The fourth thing that Luke draws out and describes to us about this lady is that she had something that was of great value. Verse 37 again. Behold, a woman in the city who was a sinner, when she knew that Jesus sat at the table in the Pharisee's house, she brought with her an alabaster flask of fragrant oil. Right? So here she is, and she has something of great value. This would not have been cheap, particularly something like this for this lady, of this sort of lady. This could have been an investment. This could have been everything she sort of has, her value, the money, the monetary value in this alabaster flask could have been everything that she had. But she had, Luke says, an alabaster flask of fragrant oil. Obviously, knowing what we know about this lady, we also possibly know then how she came to be able to buy this flask, don't we? This jar of fragrant perfume. She would have been able to purchase this with her earnings through her dubious means. If she was a prostitute, how was she able to afford this thing unless it was with the money that she had earned by being a prostitute? And there, she has it. She possesses this thing. It's still of great value to her. It's still potentially her livelihood. And she comes to this house of a Pharisee where she hears Jesus is, and she comes with the intention of pouring out and dispensing of this alabaster flask. Yes, I got it by dubious means. Yes, I was able to afford it because I sold myself to men. But I got it nonetheless. But something has happened to me, and I've heard about Jesus, and I've come to this house, and I'm going to pour all this out for Jesus. And I'm going to pour it out upon him. I don't want it anymore. I don't need it anymore. I would rather spend it for Christ and for his glory, no matter how I obtained it. You can almost imagine, can't you, that alabaster flask, if she did realize what kind of sinner she was. And if it sat there, let's say she had a mantelpiece. I know they didn't have mantelpieces in their home, but let's say she had a fireplace with a mantel, and there sat the alabaster flask. And imagine she comes home from her work that she does, and she comes into her home, and imagine it just staring at her, a reminder of the kind of person she is. Almost as if the alabaster flask could sprout lips and say to her, how were you able to afford me? How were you able to purchase me? Oh, I know what you get up to. This flask, she comes with the intention of using it to honor Christ. And by doing that, she wouldn't have it anymore, would she? It would have been all gone. Fifthly, Luke says she had been affected by the person and the message of Christ. Look at verse 38. That's another way in which Luke describes this woman. Verse 38. She stood in this house at Christ's feet. Again, remember how they're sitting around the table. We just talked about it. They would have been leaning. Their feet would have been behind them as they sort of lean upon their side. So those who were gathered round, standing there, wondering, what's going on in this event, would have been standing there. She was standing there at Christ's feet, Luke says in verse 38, and she was weeping. Something has happened to this woman. Something had happened or had been said that had brought this woman to tears. Now, whether it was before she came to this house, or whether it was while she was there, observing what was going on in the conversation that was happening at the time between Christ, whether it was before or after, she had been affected by the message of Christ. And it had brought her to tears. It touched her in a place that nothing else had ever touched, deep down in her soul. And she had been brought as a result to a place of humility. And she seems to have been touched with a sense of her sin and with a sense of her own unworthiness. And she seems to have been touched with a sense of the forgiveness of a debt that she owed to Christ. And she seems to have been touched with a need to honor Christ as a result. And so there's the picture, Luke says. She's standing there at Christ's feet while he's leaning at this table, and whatever's happened, it's moved her to tears, and she is weeping. And she's weeping so much that it begins to fall upon his feet. If this room that in which they were in was quite tight, you can imagine that, people would have been shoulder to shoulder. It would have been a bit crowded. They may have been very close to the people at the table. And you can almost imagine that whatever's happening, whether it's the conversation that happened and she suddenly realized who she was and how dirty she was and how she had been forgiven of her sin, or whether that had happened at some other point and she's just come there. Whatever's happening, she's close enough to Christ that as she begins to weep, her tears begin to fall upon his feet and begins to wet his feet. Now, what we learn further on in this story is that his feet would have been quite dirty because everyone wore sandals in those days and everything was quite dusty. It was common that when you go to people's houses, oftentimes they would provide you something to wash your feet, or if you were rich enough to have servants, the servant would wash your feet so that, you would have clean feet and it wouldn't be so dirty. It wasn't something that always happened, but it was a common luxury that if you went over to someone's house, if they offered to have your feet washed, that would have been a bit of a luxury. We find out later in this story that obviously this man, this Pharisee, wasn't really that bothered about Christ's feet being dirty. But here she is, this woman, touched by something that had gone on, and she weeps. And it falls and it begins to wet his feet. Now, the sixth thing here that Luke describes is that as a result, this woman disregards all the social norms of the day, all the customs of the day. She disregarded what was considered to be acceptable behavior. She disregarded it. How? Luke tells us she began to wash Christ's feet with her tears, and she wiped his feet with the hair of her head. She didn't have a towel. She didn't have a cloth. All she knows is that something has happened to her. And as she's standing there with the intention of honoring Christ, she is weeping. She has been so touched. And her tears are wetting his feet. And she looks down at his feet and realizes, my tears are getting on his feet. Oh, those feet are dirty. And she, instead of taking a cloth, which she didn't have, this woman, this sinful woman who was known as a sinner, bends down and unravels her hair and begins to dry off his feet. That was not socially acceptable. You don't do that kind of thing. That is what we would call is a bit weird. That is a bit getting down and dirty. You don't do that kind of thing. And she did it because she wanted to honor him. And then finally, what Luke describes to us about this woman is all of this is happening is because she has a high view of Christ. Look at verse 38. Not only does she unravel her hair and dry off his feet with her hair, she begins to kiss his feet and takes that perfume that she brought with her and begins to pour it over his feet and anoint his feet. This is luxury indeed from a woman of the world. Why is she doing this? Because she has a high view of Christ. She understands who it is that is sat before her. This is no ordinary man. This, my friend, is the Son of God, who has come to forgive sinners like me. And I think he has done that. You can imagine her thinking. And so she comes and she kisses his feet and pours the oil over it. What a picture of honor. What a picture of admiration. What a picture of reverence that she pays to Christ. Remember, think about what she's doing. She's kissing his feet. That act of kissing the foot of another, what was that normally reserved for? Or who was that normally reserved for? You don't just kiss the feet of anyone, do you? You kiss the feet of who? Royalty. A king. And here she is, kneeling now at the feet of what looks like a common man, Jesus of Nazareth, and she kisses his feet. She recognizes this, my friends, is the King of Kings. This is the Lord of Lords. And what a sight that would have been to see that woman there honoring Christ because she had a high view of him. She had a high regard for him. She viewed him as the most important thing ever. And she honors him accordingly as best she could. Now, my friends, this is an example of someone who knows the grace of God in their lives. Do we understand that? Let me ask you this evening, how do you compare with this woman? I mean, are you too proud to even compare yourself with this woman? Are you too arrogant to? Well, I hope not. How do you compare to her? Inferior social status. Look around. Is there anyone here this evening that is significant in the eyes of our society? I don't see any. I see a room full of people like me, insignificant. If I died, the majority of society wouldn't have a clue. Wouldn't change a thing. By nature, we have such a bloated view of ourselves, don't we? We have such a puffed up view of ourselves, do we not, by nature? It just comes normally to us. And even in our own eyes, we can convince ourselves that we are more important than we really are. We might be willing to look around and look at society and say, yeah, I'm willing to admit, like no one really knows me or cares about me. I'm not much really. But pride is very clever, isn't it? And the enemy can creep in and say, yeah, that's right. But what about in the little world that you live in with your friends and your family? Well, amidst that little group, you're quite significant. Am I? No. Here is a woman who knows what it feels like to be insignificant in the eyes of the world. And she understands that Christ had come for her. He had come to die for her, an insignificant woman. And she senses her need, and she comes to Christ as a result, because she realizes, I'm nobody. This church here this evening is nothing really, apart from Christ. Who are we? We're nothing. If there is any significance to us whatsoever, it is because of Christ. What about this corrupt reputation? Do we understand the depths of our depravity and the depths of our sin? My friends, we are not victims of our circumstances. We are criminals before a holy God. We have broken his law. There is no one in this room this evening that can say, I have kept God's law perfectly. None of us. We are all guilty and deserve death as a result. And sin has corrupted us. It's corrupted our natures, all of who we are. It's corrupted our minds. It's corrupted our emotions. It's corrupted our physical strength. It's corrupted everything. And without a sovereign work of God, we will self-destruct to our own damnation unless God intervenes. This woman had a corrupt reputation, and she recognized it for what it was. And Luke highlights it here for Theophilus. Now, you might be here this evening and you might say, well, I'm not as bad as others. I'm not like one of those people. I mean, I'm not perfect, but I'm not a prostitute, I'm not a murderer. Maybe. But may I remind you whose house Christ is at this very point in time. He's not at the house of a murderer. He's at the house of a goody-goody who has just the same need as this woman does, except she's got the sense to recognize it. And this proud Pharisee doesn't, even though he goes to church every Sunday. And here Christ is sitting before a religious churchgoer who knows a lot about his holy book, but he doesn't know his own heart, and he doesn't know his own predicament. This woman had a corrupt reputation. She also had a corrupt soul. And this Pharisee didn't have a corrupt reputation, but he had a corrupt soul too, and they both needed dealing with. What about us? Do we recognize the depths of our depravity and sin apart from a work of God in our lives? Remember, she was present where Christ was, despite her reputation. And here we are this evening, and we're gathered together around God's word, are we not? And have we reckoned with this, that Christ is here? Christ is present. Whatever this is, he is here, and he is present with us. He has made a promise to his people that where 2 or 3 are gathered together in his name, he will be there. He won't maybe be there. He will be there. Now, we may not be aware of this, but that's a problem, isn't it? That needs dealing with. Because where his people are gathered together in his name, he will be there and presence himself there. Is that why you've come this evening? Have you come this evening? Did you leave and walk out of your door this evening thinking to yourself, I am about to meet Christ again. I am about to enter in to a gathering of people and Christ will be there? Or are you just coming out of routine? It's just what we do. It's just what we've always done. Have we understood that we live in a society where coming to Christ is no badge of honor in our society? It is no badge of honor that the doors of this church are still open, my friends. No. If you're a Christian and you're going to follow Christ, your reputation, it's not potentially going to be a good one. There is a cost to following Christ. We don't live in a society and a culture anymore where being a religious churchgoer is a nice thing. No, that's a weird thing. That's something that's a bit odd. Have we understood the significance of our presence here as a church this evening in this community? Do you realize there is nowhere else, unless there's another gospel church somewhere that I don't know of, but at least within this relative close vicinity, there is nowhere else where something like this is happening this evening? Christ is here. Well, we could go on and on. I've got other points here, but time is coming to a close. Let me just finish with mentioning this fact that she had a high view of Christ. What about us? How do we view Christ? Do we have a high view of him? Is he worth whatever cost? Is he everything to you? Is he significant to you? Is he everything for you? If not, then there are questions to be asked. But if he is, then, oh, my friends, consider this woman. This woman who thought so highly of Christ that she was willing to bend down and whilst cleaning his feet, honor him by kissing his feet. And there she expresses her love to Christ in this way. And what a sight it must have been. There's a wonderful hymn as we finish in the old Christian hymn book. A hymn by Charles Wesley. And there was a lady who was an actor in her day. This would have been 100 or so years ago. And she was walking by some poor people's house, and she heard this song being sung. And she went in, and she listened, and she went home, and she couldn't get this song out of her head. So she went to the stage the next day to go, and there was a production going on. And she went to ask, and she stood in front of everyone on the stage, and the music played. And she didn't sing. And then they played again. She didn't sing. And you can imagine the orchestra looking at each other. They played again. She didn't sing. And then they stopped. And the entire place was silent. And she simply folded her hands and she wept. And then she began to sing this hymn that she had heard at this poor people's house. And the hymn says, "Depth of mercy, can there be mercy still reserved for me? Can my God his wrath forbear? Me, the chief of sinners, spare? I have long withstood his grace. I long provoked him to his face. I would not listen to his calls, and I grieved him by 1,000 falls. Why to me this waste of love? It seems such a waste, God, for you to love me. Why to me this waste of love? Ask my advocate above. See the cause in Jesus' face, now before the throne of grace. There, for me, the Savior stands. He shows his wounds and spreads his hands. God is love. I know, I feel, Jesus lives and loves me still. Jesus, answer from above. Is not all thy nature love? Will you not the wrong forget? Suffer me to kiss thy feet. If I rightly read your heart, if you all compassion are, bow thine ear in mercy, bow, pardon, and accept me now. And this woman sung this. She eventually left the stage, and she eventually married a minister, funnily enough. She had a high view of Christ. She understood the depths of her sin, and as a result, she was able to sing depths of mercy. Can there be mercy still enough for me? Yes. Yes, there is, and there's enough for all of us here this evening.